It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. He has spoken for us before when he was ambassador to the United States, and we're very pleased and honored to have him back in Los Angeles. He'll be speaking on the topic in defense of trade and the U.S. alliance. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the 28th U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Ambassador Tom Schieffer.
Well, thanks, Doug. It's a great pleasure to be here again. I spoke to this group 10 years ago, and I went back and looked at my remarks that I made 10 years ago because I thought it was kind of like being the preacher that talks to the congregation every Sunday about the same subject, but it's whether it gets you to the right end in the end that you worry about. But I talked about China, the rise of China. I talked to you about the U.S.-Japan alliance, and I talked to you about trade, which are pretty good topics to talk about every 10 years or so. It seems like we talk about them every year. And the fact of the matter is we do because they're so important and so key to the future of peace in the world. I was so impressed by this panel today. I prepared a formal address. It's inside this box here. But I'm not going to give that one. I thought this was such a good and deep discussion from the panel that I wanted to go over some various things that they said because I think that they are very important to where we're going in the near future and where we've been in the recent past. I thought that Professor Nakayama was exactly right when he described the effect of candidate Trump on the conversation in both the U.S. and in Japan, but more importantly in Japan and Asia. I think Mr. Trump campaigned based upon an image of Japan and the U.S. relationship in the 1980s. It was always about talking about currency manipulation. It talked about flooding the markets with Japanese automobiles. It talked about the Japan as a free rider on the U.S.-Japan alliance. That was not well received in Japan, and I think it put a real electric shock into our relationship. So I thought that when Prime Minister Abe seized the day was an extremely important moment in the relationship because he understood that it was important, I think, to bring Mr. Trump up to date on what the U.S.-Japan alliance was. And the fact that he got on the plane in November, shortly after the election, and went to New York and had the first meeting with Mr. Trump, I think had really enormous consequences on this relationship, and I think they were positive. I think Mr. Trump at that point in time was looking for someone to help burnish his credentials as far as a world leader. And Mr. Abe's fact that he was there, that they had a good talk, they had a good visit, I think was quite good for both sides. Because I think that Mr. Trump began to understand the relationship was not a situation that existed in the 1980s, and that was a positive thing. The fact that he then followed that up with the trip to Washington and Mar-a-Lago after he was president, again, very positive. They came across as meetings of people that were talking about the right things. Since that time, as we've heard, there's a lot of, Chiba-san talked about how many conversations they've had on the phone. I think that's very good. I hope that they continue to do that. It's had an impact, again, a positive impact. I would say to you that these are difficult times, and they are difficult times with relationships around the world. It's not all about Mr. Trump. I think there is something here that we need to be aware of. And that is the world that we live in now is quite different than the post-war world. The United States had some very specific things that came out of the experience of the war. There were two pillars, in my judgment, of American foreign policy. trade and alliances. The trade was first, and the United States began preparing for that kind of world with the Bretton Woods Conference, a year before the end of hostilities. Out of that came, what came out of that eventually was the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization, or its precursor of generally accepted tariffs, GATT, whatever the acronym was for. But the World Trade Organization succeeded that eventually. The United States, in my judgment, took a very enlightened view of the end of the war. The end of the First World War resulted in a peace that was persecuting to the defeated, and it didn't go anywhere. It, I think, was the precursor to World War II. In 1928, we had an election in the United States, and one candidate was very protectionist and said that if he were elected, the American worker would be protected so that the wages of other parts of the world wouldn't be able to benefit other products. He was very oriented toward creating a wall of protectionism against foreign competition. His name was Herbert Hoover, and the policy that was enacted after he became president was known as the Smoot-Hawley Act. It had devastating consequences for the United States and for the world. Huge tariffs. The two largest exports of the United States at that point in time were radios and automobiles. And the automobiles were particularly popular in Europe. When the tariff went up dramatically on German cars, the Germans retaliated with a 50% increase in tariffs on automobiles. The Italians went one better. They went to 100%. This was Adolf Hitler's government and Mussolini's government. Most of the governments of the world petitioned Washington not to go there. I think there was something like 80-something governments opposed Smoot-Hawley. And remember, this was the colonial world, and there weren't that many countries in the world as there are today. The far, far greater majority of countries opposed that, and virtually no one accepted it. That didn't lead to the Great Depression, I think most economists would say, but it certainly deepened it. And it led to political consequences in Europe, and I think in other places in the world, because it drove politics to the extremes there, in which everyone was talking about how they had to protect their own turf. Well, Bretton Woods was designed to head that off and to have a peace that was not so vindictive. After the war, and there was one other question, one other thing that the United States made a decision on, and that was to talk about collective defense. After World War I, Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations. It was designed to have this forum where people could come and head off aggressors. And of course, it was not accepted in the United States, and it went its own way and was very ineffective in the interim between the wars. So I think the President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, felt that it was very important to have a collective defense system, and his vision was that the five great powers would basically act in concert to police aggression in the world. But each of the five powers that sit on the UN Security Council have a veto. And the Soviet Union quickly exercised veto after veto. And that part of collective defense didn't really work in the way that people thought it would, or President Roosevelt thought it would. Harry Truman followed with, and the revolution in American foreign policy came after that in the Truman era when he started talking about alliances. And the first great alliance was, of course, NATO, and I think the next one was Japan. and those alliances, and there were other alliances that were around the world, but I think those alliances were the reason that we've not had another world war. Now enter Mr. Trump. So what does he campaign against? He campaigns against trade. He talks about protectionism in a way that no candidate for president has talked about since the end of the war. If you think about it, there was no candidate in any of the elections prior to 2016 that said we ought to institute more protectionism and we ought to withdraw from alliances. Unfortunately, in the 2016, there was no candidate on either side that campaigned for trade. Secretary Clinton, who had once talked about the TPP as the gold standard, said no, she wouldn't approve it. I don't think anybody really thought in the end that if she were elected, that she would still disapprove of it. I think they thought that she would figure out some way. But I think what Secretary Clinton was speaking to was what Donald Trump might have been shouting about. And that was this feeling that people are getting left behind because of trade. And if you think about it, a 40, 50, 55-year-old person, male or female, that has lost their job and does not have the skills in a highly technical world to do something that the modern economy needs done, they're going to be apprehensive about that. They're going to be worried about that. And I think that the 2016 election was a reflection of that as it was as much of the two candidates. Now, I will add that the two candidates were the first two candidates in the history of polling that were neither trusted or liked by the electorate. So Mr. Trump gets elected. And Professor Nakayama has talked about worrying about that being the normal thing. I think we have to be very careful here that we don't assume that this was just a one-off election. Peter and I were having lunch, and Doug, and we were talking about it at lunch. I think we have to have a better dialogue in the United States and other places in the world about what the positives are about trade. Mr. Trump in Japan, when he paid his visit to Japan earlier, he brought all of the business executives together and was talking about the importance of the relationship, but how we were having a deficit with Japan. And he said, couldn't you at least build some cars in America? Yeah, you laughed. Most of the country didn't, because most of the country does not know that 75% of Japanese automobiles that are sold to Americans are built by Americans. We don't talk enough about the effect of foreign direct investment in each other's economies. I think we have an opportunity right now to do something that we haven't been able to do in quite a while. If you look at trade deficits, I think, frankly, that's the wrong way to look at trade. But I think this administration is very big on trade deficits. Trade deficits sometimes occur because natural resources are involved. If you take the natural resource out of the deficit, you'll find many countries, including the United States, with some places, will have a positive trade relationship. In the United States, we are dependent, as most of the world is, on fossil fuels. As the world has changed now, it has given, with the shale revolution that has occurred, we now have enough oil and gas in the United States to export that fuel. In my home state of Texas, there's a place called the Permian Basin. That's out where Midland is. It's out in West Texas. There are now estimates that the Permian Basin has as much fossil fuels in it as Saudi Arabia. Now think about that from the standpoint, and this is an opportunity that I think that occurs particularly well for the United States and Japan. Japan needs natural resources. It needs energy. I believe that Japan is now thinking about and working toward a policy in which shale oil, shale gas from the United States in particular, that can be converted to LNG, can be taken through the Panama Canal that is now wide enough to take these big natural LNG ships through it directly into Japan. What does that do? That would reduce the trade deficit between the United States and Japan dramatically. Okay? It would also give a greater strategic strength to Japan, because most of the gas that they get now is out of Qatar. Iran previously produced most of the oil for Japan. If you can somehow have less dependence on the Middle East for oil and gas, I think you have a better relationship. And particularly if that oil and gas is coming out of the United States, I think that's a better relationship than what you have out of the Middle East. It's more dependable. It's less liable to Middle East politics. But here's something else it does. It changes the relationship with Russia for Japan, because Russia has a lot of natural gas in Siberia, and they want to sell it to Japan. But if Russia is your only source of natural gas, you got a problem. They're very difficult to deal with when they're your only source, as Eastern Europe has discovered. But if you have a source in the United States that is reliable, I think that gives you great leverage over both the Middle East situation, and particularly with Russia. And I think that would be of great advantage to both the United States and Japan. With regard to the current state of the U.S.-Japan relationship, I think that Prime Minister Abe, and I give him the credit for it, I think Prime Minister Abe seized a moment here that made a dramatic difference. And that's really good for the U.S.-Japan alliance. Nakayama-san said something that struck me. He said, "What choice do we have?" And I'm glad he said that the choice was the United States. But I think there's one other choice, and that is to go it alone. I don't think that it would be good for Japan, but I don't want the Japanese to come to the conclusion at the end of the day that they're better off going it alone. I think that would be a devastating mistake for them and for us. But the Japanese have to be convinced that the United States will be there if the balloon goes up, that they will be there on the bad days, not just the good days. Now, this is a question that has been asked through many administrations. Will we be there? And often, what I call the de Gaulle argument was made, that the United States will not risk Los Angeles for Tokyo. Well, we risked New York for Paris and for London, and I think we do it again because it works. The essence of deterrence is for the other party to believe that there is a high, not even a certainty, but a high probability that their actions will promote a devastating response. Okay? You don't have to use nuclear weapons if people think you would. The nuclear umbrella that has been extended over Japan since the end of throughout the entire Cold War worked. There is not a Japan that was dominated either by the Soviet Union or China. The deterrent capability of the United States served us and Japan well, and I think it needs to continue, and I think we need to have that message out. Because the thing that worries me most about North Korea is that Kim Jong-un might have a different outlook on things than his father did, or even his grandfather did. I think you could rationally argue that Kim Jong-il, his father, believed that if he acquired nuclear weapons, that would be his get-out-of-jail-free card, that he could always threaten retaliation, and that would preserve his regime. I don't agree with that. I thought it was a mistake. I thought it was a really bad policy, but I could see how he could come to that conclusion. What worries me about Kim Jong-un is that he can conclude that nuclear, or he can think, I think he might think, that he could do something that his father and his grandfather couldn't do with nuclear weapons, and that is unite the Korean Peninsula. Because I think he might think that the ability to hit the United States with nuclear weapons gives him the ability to force regime change in South Korea. I don't think that will happen, but that to me is what the dangerous point is in North Korea. And when you talk about what can happen, I think about a book that a woman named Margaret McWilliams wrote, which was when the war that ended peace. And it was talking about what happened in the First World War. And the thesis of the book I thought was quite interesting. It said it basically was a group of mediocre statesmen that were located in more than one capital who came to the wrong conclusion. Each thought that somebody else wouldn't possibly do it, wouldn't possibly go to war over this particular issue or that. And for a number of years before the outbreak of World War I, there were a number of crises in Europe, and they were all avoided at the last moment by some country saying it's not worth it. And they got together and they solved the problem. But the outbreak of World War I happened because they did do it. And they knew it was getting ready to be a disaster. If you went around since then, there was scholarship, I think, has shown that virtually every statesman at that point in time thought that it wasn't going to happen. And yet it did. Well, here's a scenario, and I don't want to be so negative here, but here's a scenario that worries me. I was in Japan as ambassador in 2006 when Kim Jong-il fired missiles over Japan, okay? That missile stayed up, there were 7 missiles that were fired that morning. 3 of them had the range to hit South Korea, and they worked perfectly. 3 of them had the range to hit Japan, and they worked perfectly. The 7th missile was an intercontinental ballistic missile that was designed to hit the United States, and it went up it was up for about 48 seconds, okay? And it had not nosed over. So 48 seconds, it goes up, and it basically comes back down. And the debris hits all over in the ocean, but parts of North Korea itself. If that missile had stayed up 1.5 to 2 minutes and failed, it would have bellied right into Japan. Now, we were prepared for every eventuality. I can assure you we were prepared for every eventuality. But if that missile had bellied into Japan, what do you think would have followed up on that? Now, Kim Jong-un is launching missiles that have he's taken them straight up, and he's taken a couple of them over Japan, one of them of a shorter range, one of them a longer range. But if those missiles failed, In this atmosphere today, what do you think could happen? I think it could be a replay of the events that occurred around World War I, where the Archduke is assassinated in Sarajevo, and events just tumble out of control. That's what we have to really, really be careful of right now. We're at a level in which tensions are quite high, and we have to be sure that we realize that events can tumble out of our control very quickly, and we have to ensure that we are working to prevent that. I think that's very important. Now, a lot of times, people talk about China, and they say China is the key to solving the North Korean situation. And you've heard this administration and you've heard previous administrations talk about China has to do more, okay? Here's one thing I want you to think about that bothers me about that. I agree that China has the most leverage on the North Koreans, but I think that there is an intervening thing that we too often overlook. China regards the last 150 years as an anomaly because it interrupted Chinese as the great power. I think it was in the 1840s, the two biggest economies in the world were China and India. China and India did not respond to the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the greatest goods, the finest goods manufactured in the world were coming out of China and India. They were handmade, and the porcelains there were unbelievable. The silks there, unbelievable. They had things to trade with the rest of the world, but they basically were handmade or made by hands at very low wages. The Industrial Revolution hit like a tsunami. It caused disruption in Europe. In 1848, there were revolutions after revolutions where governments fell and all that as a reaction to too much democracy from authoritarian regimes. But what happened outside of Europe was that Europe basically carved up the rest of the world because all of a sudden the goods were made by machines, not by hand. And China and India didn't respond, and they got carved up in the process. I think the Chinese remember that. And I think the day that the thing that is most sensitive with the Chinese is to be thought of as doing somebody else's dirty work. I don't think the Chinese are going to do anything publicly that would allow people to say they did it as a result of the United States bidding. I think it's something that we need to realize. And I think the more we talk about the need for Chinese involvement in public, the more counterproductive it can be. Now, I want to... General Bancho had some great points on what I think of as the Olympic overtures that are happening or happened. I think it's very interesting, and somebody's always saying connect the dots. You know, we don't connect the dots. Well, here are a few dots. The Chinese were quite upset with the South Koreans over exercises that we were doing, and they basically, under the radar, were boycotting the Korean Olympics, South Korean Olympics. They weren't buying any tickets. And when you've got 1.3 billion potential ticket buyers, if your government decides they don't want to buy those tickets, that's a pretty good message to somebody, okay? But about 6 weeks ago, the Chinese started buying tickets to the Olympics. And we go along here, and now Kim Jong-un's sister shows up at the Olympics. There was supposed to be a meeting between North Koreans and Vice President Pence. Okay? It was canceled. Now, I'm not saying that what happened here couldn't have happened by chance. But I think you have to begin to think, how would the Chinese outreach, how would the Chinese turning the screws on the North Koreans be done? And I got to tell you, it occurs to me that maybe the reason Kim Jong-un's sister showed up, maybe the reason there weren't more launches, missile launches, is maybe the Chinese took an interest in the account for a while. I don't know that's what happened. I don't know that. I am not privy to any of the intelligence as I used to be, but I can see how that could kind of make sense. We have to remind people in the theater that we all have interest in North Korea not having nuclear weapons. I was very involved in the six-party talks with the Bush administration. Everybody had it was never in doubt that the Chinese, the Russians, the South Koreans, the United States did not want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. But they couldn't figure out on what to do amongst themselves. Because what we all did was we let the North Koreans play us one off against another. And there were times when we provided fuel oil for the North Koreans to come to talks. The Chinese provided this or that. The South Koreans, took turns with us in which everybody basically paid the North Koreans to come to the table. We can't do that. And I think we've tried to wean ourselves off from that policy. But it's still in the back, I would guess, of the North Koreans' mind. And you have to be careful about that. But I don't think that we should also say that sanctions don't have an effect. What sanctions are not likely to have is an immediate effect. Everybody complains, everybody says these sanctions don't bother me until they come to the table. Saddam Hussein talked about the sanctions were not a problem for Iraq. They were, as we have learned after that, a real problem for Iraq. The Iranians said sanctions don't work, but they came to the table, and the nuclear agreement that we had with them was a result of it. The North Koreans with Banco Delta, there is no question in my mind that the Banco Delta sanctions had the greatest effect because they had the greatest effect on North Korean elites. Their money was down there in Banco Delta. That was the money that they were hiding from each other and hiding outside the country that they could access if the government fell. That brought them to the table, and there was an agreement out of that. They destroyed the nuclear reactor that they had in, it may have been out of date, but they destroyed it, and they came to the table. I think that you can still have sanctions that will work with North Korea, and we have to stay at it. China itself, I think, is not a country to be feared as much as it is a country to be respected. I think the Chinese are looking for respect as much as anything. But I agree that I think they're also looking at being a hegemon certainly in Northeast Asia and most of the world. I don't think we need to fear that as much as we need to push back when the Chinese want to act outside the norms of the international order. And they will do that, in my judgment, if they're not reminded from time to time that they have to act like everybody else if they want to be a part of the international community. It was strange to me, and I ascribe to the Professor Nakayama's talking about the Senkakus and whatnot. The Senkakus were talked about a lot, okay? Constantly talked about the Chinese until President Obama said in Japan that they were part of the security alliance. And then all of a sudden, the Chinese didn't talk about it so much. Now they went to the South China Sea later that, but they didn't talk about the Senkakus as much. If the Chinese, the Koreans, both North and South, believe that there is a strong U.S.-Japan relationship, I think all things are possible in Northeast Asia. If somehow the Chinese could divide us from the Japanese, I think everything goes south pretty quick. And that's what we really have to be careful of. These are difficult times. These are times that I don't think anybody that follows the U.S.-Japan relations or Northeast Asia, the Asia-Pacific, I don't think we've seen this since the end of the war. And we've got to redouble our efforts to stay close to each other. It would be disastrous for the United States and Japan to be divided by anybody else. One of the greatest authorities on Japan and U.S. relationship told me this, and I think it's absolutely correct. He said the relationship between the United States and Japan has to be like a seesaw. U.S. and Japan are on one end of the seesaw, China's on the other. In that kind of situation, things will balance themselves out. If you went to a triangle where Japan, China, and the United States would each be approaching each other separately, I think you could never bring anything into balance. And that's something we need to avoid. But finally, I want to say, Matt Goodman, I got to say one thing about the TPP, because I was going to actually talk about that a lot more than I did. But Matt and I were sitting at a U.S.-Japan Council event that was very large in Washington. I guess it was in November or so. And Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, made these comments. He said, he came and he made the speech, and he said the United States has a trade deficit with Japan, and we have to do better. You have to say that when you have a tariff on American beef of 50%, that things should be better than that. And Matt whispered over to me, and he said, well, it was 9% under the TPP. So I think if you had gone to Wilbur Ross on that day, at that moment, and said, would you take 9%? I think he would have said yes. We got a lot more education to be conducted with regards to the effects of the TPP than we've done in the past. It hasn't raised itself to as high a degree of discussion in the United States as it has in Japan, and that's understandable. But the TPP would have changed the dynamics of trade in Asia. It would have brought us closer together. And I have always said that the United States looked for the day when it would be as easy for an American to do business in Japan as it was for a Japanese to do business in America. That's what the TPP did. And we have to make the argument. It won't make itself. We have to go out and talk about these things in a sophisticated way, but in a way that people can understand who listen to it, to the way that 40, 50-year-old that just got laid off can understand it. That it's not about trade, it's about technology that is causing dislocation in the world economy and the American economy and the Japanese economy. All this talk about manufacturing, the manufacturing sector, and how the manufacturing sector has to be brought to the United States overlooks the fact that the manufacturing sector in the world economy has declined dramatically. And nowhere is it larger than in China. More Chinese jobs have been lost in the manufacturing sector than anywhere else in the world. We have to be honest with people and tell them what the consequences of the modern world are and the consequences of technology. We have to realize that our educational system in the United States, and frankly in Japan as well, have to respond to technology. At the turn of the last century, at the turn of the 20th century, we thought in America that a high school education was enough to compete in the world, and it largely was. By the mid-century, in the 20th century, we realized that a college education was going to have to be what we were trying to get people to get. Now I believe that we have to say to our educational systems, it's not enough to educate someone to an 18-year-old's level or to a 22-year-old's level or even a 25 or 26-year-old that got a graduate degree, okay? Because we have to have an educational system that people can plug back into at any age in order to get the skills of a modern a job requirement. That's not a Democratic or Republican idea. That's an idea that faces the reality of the situation that we're in, and it tries to do something about it. McKinsey just came out with a report a few weeks ago that talked about artificial intelligence. It said that 800 million jobs in the next decade, I believe it is, are going to be affected. The jobs aren't going to, it's not just a fact of, the jobs aren't going to be the same at the end of that decade as they were. You have to get education in there to do it, to change it, to give the skills to workers to get those new jobs that technology is creating. But right now, the technology is obsoleting jobs faster than it's creating them. And we've got to get that back in the right order. And we can't do it if we're not out there trying to retrain people to be a part of that workforce. We can do this, and we can succeed in the world, because over the next 20 years, there are going to be 2 billion plus people that are added to the middle class in the world. Most of them are not going to be Americans, most of them are not going to be Japanese, but most of them are going to be Asians. So what happens when you have a growing middle class in the world? The people that have been making $1, $2, $3, $4 a day, when they get up to making $10 a day, it's a very normal pattern for these things to happen. They eat more protein. They use more energy. They have better hygiene. They get more education. And they demand, they have better transportation. And they demand more education, and they demand better governance. That sounds like a customer to me, not a threat. We have to be able to capture that market, not forget about it, not ignore it. You cannot protect your way to prosperity. No one has ever been able to do that. But we know how to sell things. We know how to deal with hygiene. We know how to deal with energy. We know how to deal with education. We know how to grow things with protein. These are customers. We have to reach out to them, and we have to be able to do that in a civil way that is good for them and for us. That, I think, gives us some reason for hope today. Not some reason, a lot of reason for hope today. And what we have to focus on is not shouting at one another, but talking to each other in such a way that we can come up with the solutions that a modern world needs. And they need it from America, and they need it from Japan. We would never have succeeded, either country succeeded to the degree it has today, if we had imposed that vengeful peace on the world and not that enlightened view that your prosperity and my prosperity are tied together. Your security and my security are tied together. That's worked. Why in the world would we want to abandon that at a time when it can offer such promise for the future? With that, I'll answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ambassador Schieffer. We have time for 2 questions because I know a lot of people. Oh, Saori Katara from USC.
Thank you for a very inspiring speech, Mr. Ambassador. This is Saori Katara from USC. I have a question of your opinion about the US-Japan bilateral FTA, free trade agreement, especially in contrast to the TPP possibilities, and given the fact that TPP 11 without US involvement is now proceeding. Thank you.
I don't think a bilateral agreement is going to be done because I don't think the Japanese are going to do it. I think Prime Minister Abe did a very smart thing in taking the lead in keeping the other 11 nations together. And the reason I think that is so smart, there's a couple of 3 reasons to that. One, all the political sacrifice, political capital that was expended in getting TPP shouldn't be wasted. And Abe-san knows more about that than anybody else. It was a very bold action that he took by at first joining the talks and then agreeing to them. That's a good thing. But the fact that Japan stood out and stood up, I think people in the rest of Asia are looking at Japan differently than they have before. I think that's a good thing. And what I believe may have happened as a result of that is that World War II may actually be close to being over. Because I believe Japan is looked on differently today than they were before that happened. And I think that's good for Japan, and I think that's good for the United States. And I don't think Japan, I don't represent Japan. I don't represent the United States anymore either. But I think that Japan just crossed the Rubicon on that one. I don't think they're prepared to go back, and I can understand why.
One more question. Chris? What would it take to get the mic, please?
Thank you. Chris Baker with Jetro. I have a question. What would it take for North Korea to give up their nukes? Has there been any discussion about that?
I think that there's been decades of discussion about it. Nobody's figured out what that is. But I don't see how it's in North Korea's interest to promote a nuclear arms race in Northeast Asia. I think if you look at the polling in South Korea right now, 60 or 70% of some of the polls are showing that the South Koreans think they should go nuclear. I understand the nuclear allergy in Japan, but I don't think you can take for granted that the Japanese, if they felt threatened, if they felt that the United States would not be there, I don't think you can assume that the Japanese wouldn't come to the conclusion that they needed nuclear weapons too. So all of a sudden you could have a situation with North Korea in which they face not one nuclear power, but 3. And who would feel safer in that situation? I wouldn't. I think we have to be very careful that we don't do a lot of saber rattling in this, but I also think that we should not abandon what the other party subjects themselves to when they put themselves in that situation. And I don't think it is a foregone conclusion that we have to accept that North Korea has those weapons. I think we got to sit down and talk about it, and the talks privately, I think, will be different than the public talks, and I don't think it helps anyone for tweets to try to frame as complicated and nuanced a policy as this is. I just don't think that's helpful. I don't think nicknames are helpful. I think this is something that a lot of smart people have to get together and sit down and say, why is this in your interest to do this? And it's China, it's Russia, it's South Korea, it's the United States, and it's Japan. And I think we have to keep at it, and we don't give up on the idea that we can do it without talks, and we don't give up on the idea that at some point in time, the North Koreans don't have a threat of nuclear weapons. I don't know what the end looks like. I just know that we can't have a calm situation in Northeast Asia, a better situation in Northeast Asia, if everybody has nuclear weapons. That's a prescription for disaster. And I will add one other thing in regard to that. India, my master's thesis in international relations was on the nuclear weapons debate in India, okay? I came to the conclusion, and I think it was the correct conclusion, that the reason that the Indians would develop nuclear weapons was because of the Chinese, okay? And I think that's why they did. I don't think it had anything to do with Pakistan. But who developed nuclear weapons next? The Pakistanis, because of the Indian threat. And there is a domino effect in the development of these kind of weapons, and it's one we have to guard against. But I don't have the answer any more than anybody else does on what it looks like at the end. I just know we have to keep at it. And this attitude that somehow we've got to get this solved in the next 3 months or the next year or whatever is not a good way to think about it. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Schieffer. Before we close, once more, I'd like to ask you to please fill out the participant survey. Thank you. Let's give thanks to our speakers once again, Consul General Akira Chiba, Hitoshi Ishikawa of the Japan Business Association, our panel of experts, Lieutenant General Koichiro Bancho, Matthew Goodman, Toshihiro Nakayama, and Kaori Eda, and our keynote speaker, Ambassador Tom Schieffer. Once again, on behalf of the Japan American Society, I thank you for joining us today. Please enjoy the networking reception.